This is a Wild Games Production podcast.
Style thing, but I think it's going to be run more like Fight Club, because if you have them be the same guy, then you don't have to worry about who did what. And I think that twist ending, no one's ever going to be able to see. Anyways, welcome to the Save or Die podcast, Immortal Edition this time around. My name is Crispy, returning here after a pretty long absence, and with me today is our new co-host, Carl.
Hi, everybody.
So, unfortunately, at the end of the last episode, Glenn, James, and Tenkar stepped down from the podcast. But we're here. Save or Die isn't going anywhere. We're gonna keep chugging along. Vince approached me to kind of take over. So, here we are. I'm super excited. We got a lot of stuff in the works. I will say with me, I've been out of the old school game for a while. Unlike Carl, who only plays basic D&D, basic expert D&D, and the rule cyclopedia and things like that. And I think that's going to be a really good mix. For me, it's going to be a lot of rediscovering sort of my old school roots. And I'm really excited to have Carl with us to do that. Carl, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you kind of got started with gaming?
Absolutely. So my boxed D&D, the introduction to the game, was actually a board game called Hero Quest, which has RPG elements in it, but it's more of a board game. My dad was playing D&D at the time, and he bought us Hero Quest, and we sat down, we played it for a little bit, and then my dad said, "Forget this, we're playing D&D." So he invited his D&D friends over, and they showed us the game. We created a couple of characters using the second edition rule set. But then when my dad went out to get books of his own to play at home with us, he was handed the rule cyclopedia. So that was the first D&D book we owned. So my introduction to D&D was a mixed bag, but landed at the rule cyclopedia, where we started playing the game regularly.
Okay. And it's... I had forgotten for a second that you're also, like me, we're kind of younger guys, especially for the old school. I'd forgotten for a second that you're, like, also young, and so I was like, this was back in the 70s. It's like, oh, how did your dad played D&D first? That didn't make sense.
My dad's old enough to have been involved, but he actually discovered D&D only a few years before I did. Okay. He still plays to this day. My whole family plays the game, actually.
Is that you mean your parents and like brothers and sisters, or like your actual like immediate your family?
Both of those are true. Huh. So yes, my dad and mom play. My family, we were all homeschooled, and my parents would use RPG rule sets to teach us history and reading and math, because there is so many educational elements in Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games. So we grew up with the game, and then I've passed it along to my own children, and my wife plays, and it kind of happened that way. My sister got her husband playing, and my brother got his wife playing. So if you marry into the family, it's not long before we sit you down at the table and have you roll some dice. It just seems to be a sickness.
That's really interesting. I don't have a parallel for that. I tried to teach my little sister once, but she couldn't wrap her head around the idea that a game just continues. She's like, well, what if this happens and we fail doing it? And I was like, well, then we do this. So like, oh, you got caught at the gates, but the guard is corrupt, so he'll accept a bribe to let you go. It's like, yeah, but then what if none of us can swim? We have to cross the river. She's very pessimistic. She's a very pessimistic child. She didn't get the idea of anything can happen. I think in her head it was anything can go wrong. which, sure, that's a fun way to play the game, but I don't know if she quite understood, like, you can do anything in this game and failure isn't the end.
That's funny because I kind of had the same resistance from my wife when she learned that you don't actually ever win the game, and she didn't understand the point of it. But it's in hindsight, I've realized the best way to explain it is it's really a series of small victories. You're always winning. You know, each quest is its own goalpost, and once you take out that dungeon or take out that bad guy or solve that problem, you have a victory, and then you move on to the next victory. It's a game where you're winning all the time, especially if you're having fun, because that's the only way to really win the game.
Yeah, and you're winning all the time, but the game gets harder. Like, cool, I beat the Lich King, and now I have a sweet sword. That just lets me fight even stronger stuff. So now, you know, I was fighting skeletons. Now I'm going ahead and I'm fighting skeletons that are on fire. I played a lot of video games as a kid. That's my measure for how things progress in a world. It's the same enemy, just palette swapped.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of modern correlation between explaining an RPG in terms of a video game, where when we look at the history of it, the video game emulated the RPG.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting because I think it's allowed a gateway for a lot of people who may have never sat down at a table and tried Dungeons and Dragons. It created those terms in a more public lexicon than they have existed before.
Yeah, I tried to explain RPGs to a friend a few years ago. Her boyfriend, who I was also friends with, played second edition, and like we both bonded over our love of RPGs, and she just didn't get it. But she was a big video game person. She loved like Final Fantasy and things like that. And I was like, okay, like, who's your favorite character in Final Fantasy? And she's like, this person. I go, imagine you are that person, and then instead of beating the game, you win, but then you get to do another entire game after that. And that's like the simplest way that I can explain it. Like, you're this person in the world and you do these things, but it never ends unless you die. But even then, like, that's a minor setback at best.
I mean, there's a lot of ways to come back or revert that.
Which actually brings us into our topic for today. So today we're actually kicking things off. We're going to continue kind of what James and Eric and Glenn were doing with the Class Act series here. And today we're going to be talking about Clerics.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
Are you enjoying the show you're listening to right now? Want to help support the show? Why not head over to the Patreon site, patreon.com/WGP. That's patreon.com/WGP. And help support the network for as little as $1.50 a month. That's right, $1.50 a month goes a long way. Thank you.
So the Cleric to me is really interesting. I actually think the first thing I want to dive into, because as we were doing research for this, the most interesting thing I think we came across was the history of the inception of the Cleric and how they got their start as like a Van Helsing kind of character, as opposed to kind of what they ended up becoming, which was like more of a, I think they're more of a holy knight, like a crusader or a knight of the round table kind of thing. Some people see it differently.
I agree. I think that's where the perception has come to with anybody regarding the class. But it is interesting from what we were able to find online, and hopefully this is very accurate information, but the original introduction of the Cleric was as a vampire slayer, and that's what the class was called. And it went through some name changes before it became a Cleric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was more of a monster hunter, and it's all because it's a playtest class, so there was kind of an escalating arms race with characters in the Arneson game at that time, and somebody's character, who was, I think they were the Lord of Blackmore from what I had read originally, they got turned into a vampire who then became Sir Fang. And I guess like we could just kind of read the original telling of it. This comes from Mike Menard. Do you know where this was originally posted? This little piece of lore.
I originally found it on RPG Net, but it's referenced in a lot of blog posts. I think it would be a good idea to link to those blog posts in the show notes.
Yeah, well, I will definitely do that.
Really collect the information well.
Yeah, so the best kind of omnibus, I guess, of the information here would probably be from blackmoremistara.blogspot.com, Havard's Blackmore blog here. So kind of reading an excerpt here from Mike Menard, who was a player at the game, but he wasn't the person who had come up with the cleric. He goes, I was there. In Chainmail, there were wizards that functioned as artillery. Then there was Dave Arneson's first miniatures / role-playing campaign. Some players were good guys and some players were bad guys, and Dave was the referee. One of the bad guys wanted to play a vampire. He was extremely smart and capable, and as he got more and more experience, he got tougher and tougher. This was this was the early 70s, so the model for the vampire was Christopher Lee in Hammer horror films. No deep folklore. Well, at the time, nobody could touch Sir Fang. Yes, that was his name. And I think it's really funny because the last name of the person who was playing Sir Fang was Fant, and I believe he was originally Lord Fant, so that one letter change when he became vampire.
You see that a lot in early D&D where they just kind of play with their own names to get
everyone
character names.
Listed in this blog, they were, Sir Fant and let me see here if I can find this. Oh, goodness gracious. I know the original character's last name was Sir last name here, Sir Carr, or like Father Carr or something like that. But yes.
I think that was the first cleric was Carr.
Yeah. Do you see it on here?
Dave Fant was the player. This is from the Thank You Sir Fang blog post from Sham's Grog and Blog.
Okay.
Which is also fantastic. And I don't see where they mention his name before he became a vampire, though.
Yeah, I do know that he was the Lord of Blackmore at the time when he got turned into a vampire. It's really interesting to me because Mike Carr actually, in a quote from him, he really downplays his involvement with it. In an expert same from Havard's Blackmore blog, he says, it's true that I did take part in the original Blackmore campaign and did play the role of a priest, participating in a few dungeons and overland expeditions. I also recall having the ability to cast 1 or 2 healing spells and having the ability to the ability to heal minor wounds. But in retrospect, it's obvious my character was low level and not particularly impressive. So he really downplays it, but to hear Mike Menard say it, he's like, no, this was our dirty bomb to destroy Sir Fang.
Right, and I think what's really interesting about Sir Fang and the creation of the cleric, compared to other classes in Dungeons and Dragons that kind of spring from fantasy literature, with rangers emulating Strider and the elf kind of emulating Elric and wizards emulating Gandalf and other wizards in literature, and their need of a thief class because there are so many thieves in literature. Dungeons and Dragons created the cleric,
the priest,
the other way around,
as it was called in the playtest. And it was based off of Van Helsing, which it really did kind of retain. I think it being the priest is sort of where the sort of holy warrior thing came in, and apparently that was Gary's idea. Actually, was to
from what I've read, it originally was called just Vampire Slayer.
Mhm.
They made a Vampire Slayer class, and the Vampire Slayer had some abilities that kind of model the cleric, had some healing, could turn undead, but didn't have a spell list. And then it got renamed Priest, and then Gary was the one who implemented the lack of edged weapons, the limitation of the class compared to the fighter class. So I think that's interesting because all of these components kind of fell in place. We don't have a literary reference for everything the cleric does, but we have bits and pieces for place. The edged weapons restriction comes from a couple of different places. There's and I could be saying this completely wrong, Boyo Tapestry. It's Beyeux Tapestry, and we will have that in the show notes as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a book called The Song of Roland, who has a character in it, Bishop Turpin, which is also going to be in the show notes. But that seems to be Gary's primary inspiration for the way the class, the direction it took.
Yeah, I believe the quote is from Archbishop Turpin. That's the live by the sword, die by the sword, like truism.
Right. Yes.
Which is very interesting. I do kind of want to jump into this with clerics. I mean, we can touch on this a little bit later, but how much of a stickler are you on that with the no edged weapons?
I think in a lot of ways it doesn't make any sense, because especially the thing I hear repeated over and over again is they're not allowed to draw blood. And the idea that you can bludgeon someone to death with a mace without drawing blood is just clearly not true.
Yes.
Now that's... Go ahead.
Oh, I said yes. I'm agreeing with you.
But that's not saying that there's not stuff in Dogma that doesn't make sense. But what I do in my games, just in my home games, to try to make that make more sense, is I view the cleric as the primary function being to fight undead. Mm-hmm. And undead's foot soldier being the skeleton, then of course the cleric's primary weapon is the mace, because his primary enemy isn't affected as drastically by swords.
Yeah, and when you had written that in the show notes, I really, really like that idea where you kind of do take them back to their Van Helsing roots, where they are, it's not a knight in chainmail armor with a shield and a mace. It's a Van Helsing, or he's got the wide-brimmed hat and the duster and, a mace that when you hit people, it sprinkles holy water out of it. I really like that. With me, with the no edged weapons thing, I don't agree with it, but when I am playing classic D&D, I do stick to it. I don't know why. It's just it's one of those little quirks that I think adds just a little bit of flavor. Of course, everyone has seen enough Murder, She Wrote to know that if you hit somebody in the back of the head with something blunt, there's gonna be blood. But I think it helps to differentiate them, and I think that's why Gary did it, to differentiate it from just being a better fighter.
I think one thing that kind of happens in people's games is they try with Dungeons and Dragons to cover as much ground as possible, and I think Dungeons and Dragons works best when you respect the archetypes.
Yeah.
And that's just a personal play preference of mine. And when I say that, what I would do with a sword wielding cleric is I would probably run it as an elf, as opposed to trying to adjust the cleric class to suit. But I think it works best when you stay within the archetypes, because the archetypes are there to give people their jobs.
Yeah, I just had a conversation about this the other day, where I think the main difference with classic D&D versus because there's racist class and, non-humans outside of the elf are by definition fighters, I think it definitely does work more in archetypes versus jobs, sort of what you're doing in the world. And that's a neat thing. Like, I like your idea of clerics being monster hunters. I also really like that outside of original D&D, the paladin doesn't really exist. If you're just playing basic expert or back me D&D, you don't really have the paladin as it exists in later editions. So your cleric can become that holy knight. And so you kind of, your archetypes are still there. Your fighter is, or fighting man is like your Conan or your like Fafhrd, or John Carter of Mars kind of character. Your magic user remains your Raistlin or your that's so inbred to reference D&D literature when going with D&D archetypes, but your Gandalf and your like Jack Vance wizard, and your thieves are going to be like your, I guess still Conan, but a thief is its own show that they already did. So let's not get too much into that. It allows you to have another archetype where you can have a paladin or a holy knight or, kind of a knight in shining armor, like a Galahad or a King Arthur. Whereas the fighter is more of a swashbuckler.
I agree. And I think one thing I want to point out, paladins did show up in Beckme. Mm-hmm. As the lawful fighter that did not have a keep.
Yeah.
Once you get to a high enough level to attain lordship, if you are a traveling lawful fighter, you can become a paladin. But Beckme is a widespread. Yeah. But it is a different class than it is presented in AD&D and beyond, mm-hmm. in that it is not quite a mix per se of the cleric and the fighter as it becomes in later versions. There's no casting.
Yes.
They have some innate abilities. Mm-hmm. But I think in classic D&D, a fine way to get that archetype is using the cleric and just allowing them use of a sword. Yeah. I don't think it breaks the game. And I think one of the things that works really well in classic D&D is experimentation, because it's a hard system to break.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, there's really no such thing as game balance. It's an illusion, and that holds true for modern RPGs. I think the obsession with game balance it's no one's ever gonna. It's like that Louis C.K. bit from Louis, actually, where he tells his daughter, "You're never gonna have what someone else has. You don't look in your neighbor's bowl to see if they have more than you. You look and see if they have enough." And that's something that, like, I think original D&D and classic D&D really does very well. Everyone is very spread out. There's no skill system. There's no overlap. That's my least favorite thing in later editions, is when people pick skills. And I'm playing an archetype because that's how I think. My brain is wired in kind of classic D&D archetypes. If I'm playing an archery fighter who was a scout in the military, and then we have our rogue who also, just because they get 85,000 skills, they also chose all the scouty things, it makes me useless outside of combat. Whereas in classic D&D, the fighter's always going to be the best at fighting, the wizard is always going to be the worst at fighting, and then depending on how you set up your character, things that you can do, and things that you want to try, that's going to be based on the narrative.
Yeah, and I think a class system like you have in early Dungeons and Dragons is a skill system. When you pick being a cleric, we'll assume your character knows about religion. We'll assume your character knows about what to do in a church, or how to locate a church, or how to talk to a priest. We don't need to have a knowledge religion skill mm-hmm. to dictate that.
I definitely agree. I do kind of want to talk a little bit about the paladin as it pertains to classic D&D. I make this argument all the time for 5th edition. I don't think the Paladin and Ranger should be a thing. I think that should be done as an archetype of a fighter or an archetype of a cleric. But the Paladin in classic D&D is a lot different than a cleric who eventually gets a horse, as it kind of is, and can use a sword in later editions. And I think that's really interesting that they gave the option, but it's definitely, it's a different kind of class. You know, it's still a fighter, and they can lay on hands, and they have to do lawful deeds, and they really can't have any treasure. They can have, 4 pieces of magical equipment, and then they have to tithe everything.
Yeah, I think it's a Gawain archetype from Arthurian lore that they're really following.
Oh my god, it absolutely is. You're absolutely correct. Like, that's clicked right into place with that.
So that's another example of a character from a previous story that people wanted to play in Dungeons and Dragons. And again, with the cleric being a creation of the game. I really think that's one of the most interesting things about the cleric is it was almost built from necessity. There's not really a undead hunting, mace wielding, heavily armored warrior priest in any fiction that I can think of prior to Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, and even
but now
the healer,
every fantasy game has them.
Yeah, even the healer in a lot of fantasy novels was more of a shamanistic. So what I would think of kind of what the druids become. You know, it's
in
Tolkien,
it's the elves and the rangers.
Yeah,
they're the only ones healing people. And a lot of times healing in a lot of older stories, I read a lot of old 1800s fantasy and it's tied to a place more than it's tied to a person.
Oh, sort of like an Avalon kind of thing, right?
Right, and you see that in Tolkien as well. They stay at Rivendell, they stay at Lothlorien, and they get rejuvenated. It's not a person who applies the healing necessarily. Now, what we do see is more powerful elves like Elrond, Galadriel, and then also in the House of Healing, we see Strider apply healing. But that's in no way that we can trace that to now the cleric, who is the healer of Dungeons and Dragons.
And I think that's interesting because it goes back to what you were saying about it being a creation out of necessity for the game. Sort of what that quote from Mike was it Mike Moreland? Am I getting that right? Monard.
Are you going with Michael Mornard?
Yeah, what Mornard was saying is you had wizards who were artillery, and then you had fighting men, and that was it. There wasn't really any way to heal in battle. So the sort of the old cliche of we need a healer to join our group for the new person coming in. The cleric has literally always been that.
Yeah, it started as that, like, let's create this class because we need it, and now you tell your friends that, can you play this because we need it.
Yeah. That's really interesting. How it's like a snake.
But he summarizes it. Mr. Mornard summarizes it as we made some stuff up because it sounded fun. That was how it was created. It helped the game.
Yeah,
and it's now, to me, become a staple of the fantasy world.
Yeah. That's how I've always felt with there's a lot of really weird things that became hard-coded in AD&D and its derivatives. Like fire, like a ring of fire resistance and drowning in lava. So you just, like, it's a Sir Fang thing where, like, at some point a DM put them on a lava bridge fighting orcs, and an orc pushed Melf over the edge, and Melf died, and then next campaign they found themselves in a similar, a chasm above a lava river again, and he did it that time to the orc, and that's how they got bull rush rules out of that. And then eventually this DM's just hypothetically he's a huge fan of lava. He's just lava and all its accoutrement. He's a big fan of it. But this time, Jason's new elf, Melf the Fourth, he found a ring of fire resistance when they fought the baby red dragon 2 weeks earlier. And then, the orc pushes him off the edge into the lava, and he goes, "Well, you're dead." But, did I say Jason or Jeremy? Melf's character goes, "Well, no, I have a ring of fire resistance. I'm immune to fire." And the DM sits there and he thinks for a second. He goes, "Yeah, but you can't breathe underwater, so you still drown." And that's why we have 75 pages in the 3.5 manual for why you can still drown in lava. These sort of rules were built from necessity, from things that came up in the game.
Yeah, that's I remember during the playtest for 5e, where they were at one point going to make dwarves immune to poison, as opposed to just getting a bonus, and it created all these kind of scenarios that, well, what if the god of poison was going to poison a dwarf? Could the god of poison create a poison that could poison a dwarf? And what I think with OSR and classic Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of those rules aren't stated, because when you're at the table, the dungeon master is the author of Dungeons and Dragons to some extent. And he writes the game that you're playing that day, or she.
It's the spirit of the rules, not the letter of the rules, that dictates the fun, to paraphrase Gygax. I'm definitely this lava discussion has definitely brought up, I'll leave in the show notes my own personal house rules. I use a product called Fire and Brimstone. It's a revolutionary RPG document. I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. So we've talked about how we sort of can run clerics. Let's actually kind of talk about what clerics can do, as opposed to, the history of them here. Let's go. I'm going to get over to original D&D here from, booklet 1, Men in Magic. They're kind of, they eventually did become that heavily armored healing tank, I suppose. Where
I think what's interesting about the way they're presented in Men in Magic is they're kind of presented as the middle ground. Mm-hmm. They're both fighters and casters. Because the original description says they gain some of the advantages from both of the other two classes. Mm-hmm. So when you present that way, you see them as, we have wizards, we have fighters, and this is the in between. This is the middle of the road option for people who want a little bit of both.
Yeah, and there was that in original D&D, there's, what kind of magic armor and what kind of magic weapons was a big thing for Gary, just kind of extrapolating sort of what he did with AD&D and, what magic equipment you could use. They can use all the magic armors and all non-edged magic weapons, whereas, a fighter, could use all those things, but a magic user couldn't. So you get, if you're going with the original rules and if you're not using variable weapon die, like, that's not really a drawback in my opinion. If you get all of the same magical
that's one
weapons,
of those things that depends, at what table you're at, because there's no reason why a dungeon master can't create in his game a magical mace that's just as powerful as any magical sword.
Yeah.
Even if the book doesn't present the option, the swords are a little bit more powerful in the book than the magical blunt weapons. Mm-hmm. But when you're sitting at the game creating it, no, it doesn't really limit you, the dungeon master, from creating whatever weapon you want for whatever character. And I think that's one of the we talked a little bit about balance. One of the ways that the game is actually balanced is by a skilled DM's reaction to the characters and their circumstances.
Yeah, there's that whole sort of almost like the tone poem of classic D&D, where you're not really going so much for the rules so much as the feel. And I think that's like from what we've talked before the show with like DMing style. I think we're both we're pretty fast and loose. Like I had said, I was like, yo, you want a wizard with a sword? All right, cool, whatever. Like, sure. That's fantasy enough. And I think we're not doing things like a point buy for stats. You're not creating a character for organized play. And organized play rules eventually came out of that being a necessity, because you would have one DM who would be like, everybody gets 15 magic items. You want a plus 17 mace of dragon destruction? Sure, it's cool. You want to be a big bad I almost said Beetleborg.
That's fine. You could be a big bad Beetleborg at my table.
Yeah.
Let's roll them up.
Yeah, I mean your mentor's a ghost, whatever, it's fine, Actually, I think the cleric would be the best way to make a big bad Beetleborg, because they're heavily armored, they deal with the undead a whole bunch. Anyone
That's
over
fair.
the age of 30 has no idea what I'm talking about. I'll leave it in the show notes.
That's an unfortunate thing. I think even a lot of people under the age of 30 are possibly missing the reference. It's not completely obscure, but it's fairly obscure.
Only people between the ages of 23 and 32 know what I'm talking about. We've got a good 9-year listener demographic there that are gonna understand Haim Sabam's big bad Beetleborgs. Jeez. I need a second to recover from that. If you want to make the big bad tank, sure, I'll help you do that. Whereas another DM was running like just a fight for survival, where you're dropped off in a cave and left for dead, and now you've wound your way through this subterranean catacomb, killing monsters with your bare hands and taking like roughshod equipment and arming yourself that way, and fighting your way through the surface through a bizarre underground land. And then guy A from the first game goes to the second game, and he's like, oh yeah, no, I have a lightsaber. It was given to me,
Sure.
I got that at 5th level. Also, I'm level 36 already. Game's only been out for a year and a half.
Well, I mean, that's certainly part of the encoding of classic D&D, where it's a little bit looser.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at the history of why Advanced was created, a lot of it was to curtail some of that from happening.
Yeah.
Kind of have a more coded structure to the game that you could use among a large player base and still have similar characters with similar experiences.
Yeah.
Have it all be in one book and all. It's in 3 books, but what I mean is it's not spread over, at that point, only 3 years of supplements, but when they started creating Advanced, it had already become a problem.
Yeah, having a tournament play, and even from there, they then had to further create the RPGA, and sort of today, we have pretty strict, not tournament rules, because that's not a thing anymore, but there's definitely a strict organized play, like archetype not archetype, there are rules that you have to follow. Now they're doing a player's handbook plus 1 supplement for character creation, so people don't get out of hand. I want to actually talk about real quick, where do you think Turn Undead came from? Because we've kind of gone through this whole thing, and we haven't really talked about this. I think
when you watch a lot of those old 60s, 70s horror films, I'm a fan. There's a lot of times where I think the classic example is the vampire and the cross. You raise up your holy symbol and you rebuke the vampire or its servants.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where the idea comes from. I think it is a Van Helsing trope and nowhere else. There's a old movie that I suggest everybody watch called Horror Rises from the Grave. And it's one of the finer bad B movies of yesteryear, where these warlocks were beheaded and then brought back to life in the modern times that the movie represents. But they have undead servants, and they are driven out by fire or holy symbols, and it looks so much like what you imagine a Dungeons and Dragons turn undead effect to look like. They're kind of recoiling and backing away, and to me, I think that's where the concept has its birth.
Okay,
is those old Hammer horror films and movies like it.
For me, it's because I maybe have seen one Christopher Lee vampire movie, not very many, but because I am a dirty millennial, to me, there's this weird anime, like it goes to things like Vampire Hunter D or like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where there's like...
Well, I think...
Go ahead.
I think we're talking about children of the same dad.
Children of the same dad.
And what I mean is, D&D's inspiration and Buffy's inspiration and Vampire Hunter D's inspiration for that idea all goes back to, a long enough timeline to the Hammer horror films representation of how they rebuked undead. But then if we trace it back further than that, it goes to Bram Stoker, and then before Bram Stoker, there's a novel called Vampire, which is just Vampyr. Thought to be the first vampire novel, and I believe that's correct. I could have that spelling wrong.
Okay, I'm almost positive you're right with that. I think that is I know of that movie, and that book, and I definitely think that is the right spelling. Yeah, I guess for me it's sort of like, there's just anime lasers involved when you're doing Destroy Undead.
Oh, sure.
A lot of whooshing effects in my head. That's how I just process it. It's interesting because at a certain point, the cleric does become powerful enough to just destroy undead entirely. At 4th level, a skeleton it's nothing to you. You roll a couple dice.
At some point, and really not that far away. At 4th level, you're just destroying them outright. And so that is true. That I don't know of a literary example of that happening. I know of literary and film examples of turning undead, but the idea of them just being destroyed outright by a holy symbol, I can't think of one, that predates D&D.
I definitely think turning and at least destroying undead definitely came more in with the cleric becoming powered by a source from above, a divine power. I think turning was probably what they were doing with in the playtest in Artisan's game when it was, when they were fighting Sir Fang and his undead minions. But I definitely think, holding out your holy symbol and a beam of light shooting through, the center of a skeleton and it exploding into dust definitely comes from, I think, them becoming holy knights. And that's the thing with, like, destroying undead. Again, I go back to things like Buffy, where you stake, you stake Paul Rubens through the heart, and he should explode, but he doesn't. But all the other ones that you've staked, they crumble to dust. Paul Rubens is just a little too... He's got too many hit dice to be destroyed by Chris.
He's a higher level vampire.
Yeah, he's a higher level, so he, it hurts him. But it doesn't quite kill him off.
Um, you know,
Go ahead.
I think that's the way that looks. Me, I think of Destroy Undead as almost like fire enveloped and more
Oh yeah, definitely.
traditional vampire in sunlight,
Mm-hmm.
type of thing where they kind of crumble. With Buffy, for example, that was a narrative driven thing where the vampires had to turn to dust because it just got rid of a lot of red tape for them to deal with.
Yeah. I definitely think them being enveloped in flames and being destroyed that way is a great visual representation. I wanted to bring this up real quick because I'm looking at the table in OD&D.
Sure.
So having the roots as a vampire hunter, vampires in the original Three Little Brown books cannot be destroyed. They're even, once you reach, what is this, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, once you reach 6th level, that's when you can actually start turning a vampire, but it's real hard. You have to roll an 11 on 2d6.
Right.
So the cleric isn't even that good at what it was originally supposed to be doing.
So you mean on their turn undead roll,
Mm-hmm.
they don't ever have the option at the levels presented in OD&D.
Yeah, they cannot destroy a vampire, and they're not even particularly good at turning them, to be honest.
So another interesting thing in going to the Vampire Slayer in OD&D, the Monsters and Treasures supplement, where we talk about vampires.
Mm-hmm.
They are killed if exposed to direct rays of sunlight, immersed in running water, impaled to the heart with a wooden stake. Otherwise, they're only hit by magic weapons like specters.
And I guess because I'm also, the reason I brought that up is I'm working my way in the original
Rules.
version to
Traditional ways of killing vampires: sunlight, immersed in running water, and impaled to the heart with a wooden stake. These are carryovers from folklore and also from horror movies.
A lot of that stuff actually is just from contemporary literature. I'll try to find it. I read a very large blog post recently about vampires in fiction and sort of the things like running water and staking through the hearts and things like that, and how in actual folklore, in human real world folklore, a lot of that stuff is not there, and a lot of where it comes from is from other things that people kind of just extrapolate. Well, yeah, they did this, and I guess that would work for vampires as well. It's actually really interesting. Things like sunlight and vampires, like garlic and things like that. Even staking them wouldn't kill them. It would just incapacitate them until it was removed.
Yeah, the thing I've always heard is the staking through the heart comes from nailing corpses to the ground during their burial so they couldn't come back. I don't know how true that is. Another thing I've heard about vampirism is that in folklore, it could be anything that you felt weaker or affected by. So like literally, like your bread could be vampiric and you throw it out because you're like, this bread's draining me. So, that brings us to a lot of options for Dungeons and Dragons play: vampiric bread and, vampiric stools.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of look at sort of the things. Their spell list, I think, can kind of give us a little bit of insight with the playtest and what they eventually became through. Like the Find Traps spell. That's something that I don't really associate with a holy warrior or a priest. I think that would be more, Van Helsing going into Dracula's castle or where he's keeping his coffin in London, and
of necessity, like they just make it a little easier on you in the dungeon, because the terms we use now in a lot of modern RPGs is support class.
Yeah.
And that may go back further than I'm giving it credit for. Make life easier. for a lot of people. So that find traps, because there was no other mechanical alternative to that other than poking things with a 10-foot pole and hoping you come out all right.
Yeah.
So it may, I don't recall seeing that in anything but classic D&D spell list. I don't recall seeing it in more modern games.
I would have to look, and maybe I'll do like an edit as an addendum. One thing that a fifth level cleric does get is the ability to cast continual light, which is equal to full daylight. So they are a little better equipped to kill a vampire off, without turning it or without destroying undead a little bit earlier than they can actually turn a vampire. So they can they can do continual light while they're fighting the vampire and just kill it, just destroy it through, the means as you would in just regular folklore.
Okay, yeah, that is interesting. So, it's a thing with old school gaming, and it's a thing that I sometimes have a little trouble doing, where you throw a harder creature at a lower level party and kind of expect them to find a way to solve it. It's a problem to solve.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something I think every dungeon master would allow. Whether the light shed being equal to full daylight makes it the same as daylight, might throw that out, and I think there's some that would certainly allow it. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, because it lets them fight that stronger creature. Even if you don't have it destroy the vampire, if the vampire, it gives them a break. They can, if your cleric was smart enough to cast continual or to prepare continual light for that day, I would say let them have it. One thing that's kind of interesting looking at the cleric spell list in the original game is they don't have, they have things like create food and commune and raise dead, but they don't have stuff like, meteor swarm or the spell that lets you cast down a pillar of flame from the sky. You do get sticks to snakes, which is my favorite D&D spell of all time, and Mike Merles, if you're listening, please put sticks to snakes in 5th edition. Please, Mike Merles, why won't you answer my emails anymore? Which is, of course, based off of Moses.
Sure.
And a lot of their spells, they're definitely
he had a weaker version, stick to snake.
Yes, he absolutely did.
It's a lower level.
Yeah, because sticks to snakes is a 4th level spell in original D&D. So that's a lot of snakes. That's 2 to 16.
Moses had to use all of his spell slots on Par and Waters. He didn't have enough room, except for one stick, one snake.
Yeah. And so the cleric is definitely in at least the original game. I'm not sure if it's the same in like Back-Me D&D. Definitely more of the defensive, kind of like you had said earlier, the utility character. Protection from evil, speak with plants, create water, neutralize poison, dispel evil, create food. You're definitely more of a support character.
I think it's an idea that follows the cleric through all of classic D&D, all the way through Beck-Me into the Rule Cyclopedia. The cleric being kind of this mechanic in class form is one of the things I think that defines classic D&D and old school D&D, in that the clerics exist because they help make the game run better and more fun. And I think in a lot of modern versions where they spread that a little thin, that kind of the motifs. we see a lot of those abilities represent in other classes, and you see that across the board in modern RPGs, where the thief has a job, but he also possibly has the same job as two other characters in your group because they've added a skill system, or they've tweaked some things to allow the thief to operate a little bit differently and let other characters operate as a thief. Where in classic D&D, the thief to me, and the cleric and the fighter and the magic user, they all have a job, and it's a mechanics driven job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of what I was touching upon earlier when I was, I don't think that I wish in 5th edition, not to make this a 5th edition show, because it absolutely isn't, just kind of touching upon it, I don't think that the paladin and the ranger are necessary as their own classes. I think they can be archetypes, kind of, like your battle master or your eldritch knight. I don't think that they're, because it's become so mechanic based in later editions, I don't think that you need to have these as an archetype. I don't know what I'm trying to say here. I guess
No, I get what you're saying. So essentially it's two sides of the same coin, where you can either have an archetype for all of these options,
mm-hmm.
or you can tack on a skill system and allow the archetypes a wider spread. But what they've done with modern games is they've done both. They have all the archetypes, and all the archetypes are kind of weakened with a skill system and kind of lessened as an archetype, to where your fighter's kind of already covering stuff you would imagine from a paladin.
Yeah.
So
that's exactly it, actually. And we on Critical Wits, we did a whole episode about this, classes, career archetypes. I believe it's episode 12. You should go give that one a listen. Just gonna plug my own stuff a little bit here.
Hey, you plug your show on your show. That's what you do.
Yeah, I'm trying to find, at least in the original edition, the higher level spells for clerics. I am failing at doing that. I don't know which book they're in.
Yeah, I assume you would need to go to Greyhawk first and look there.
Greyhawk, yeah. While I'm doing that, can you look through, if you have like your rule cyclopedia, can you kind of look at things, what clerics can do past, 5th level spells, or 5th level spells and above?
Oh, sure.
Because I think that's when they start getting into the stuff where they can literally bring down the wrath of God.
Yeah, I remember the scariest spell for a cleric, or possibly any character to have, was Creeping Doom.
That's my second favorite original D&D spell. Also,
which
very
is
good
just
blog.
a swarm of terrible insects coming at you at a slow pace.
Yeah.
But it's still one that I remember fondly, and I believe it exists in the rule cyclopedia, but I'm having trouble locating it.
I believe it does. I think I have the rule cyclopedia text more or less memorized for Creeping Doom, where you summon, I think it's like 250.
Yeah, it's
like
actually
centipedes.
A druid spell.
Mm-hmm. And each one does 1 point of damage.
Yeah, it's just a druid spell. It's not a cleric spell. So
okay.
Backtrack on that. Has nothing to do with the cleric.
I think in certain versions it is.
Druids are similar to clerics in a lot of ways, and they are actually
That's a whole other show, like the druid, because the druid was just a specialized form of cleric. It was just them going like, hey,
right.
Like here's how you can specialize on archetype.
And that's how it's presented in the rule cyclopedia as well.
Yeah. Oh man, I can't find higher level spells. I am trying to look for it. Here we go.
So looking at the rule cyclopedia here, sixth level clerical spells. We see Cure All. I remember that being a huge boon. It's the most powerful of the healing spells.
Mm-hmm.
So when used to cure wounds, it cures nearly all damage, leaving the recipient with only 1d6 points of damage. So that's interesting because it reverses the effect of a cure spell. Instead of curing a number of points, it cures everything but a number of points.
Oh, that is interesting.
So we go to 7th level, and now we're really seeing them kind of shape the world around them. 7th level cleric spells include Earthquake, Raise Dead Fully, Travel, allows aerial or gaseous form travel, and Wish. Now that's a powerful spell.
That is a powerful spell. That's the most powerful spell, really.
Yeah, and that's as high as it goes in the rule cyclopedia, 7th level.
Okay. Yeah, I just found
spells.
what I was looking for here. For clerics, here we go. Yeah, in clerics, they get a couple of new options in Greyhawk. They get Silence, which, interesting enough, Silence, not so much. At least in JRPGs, it's used as a way to stop magic users from casting, and that sort of became a thing in later editions as well, but it's really for stealth, because you can cast Silence on yourself and your party and move with no sound, so you can sneak up on, everyone. You get things like Snake Charm, which, sure, okay, and then you start getting things like, Blade Barrier or Word of Recall or, Earthquake, Aerial Servant, Wind Walk, which, turns you into Son Goku from Dragon Ball. Just kind of
I want to turn into Son Goku.
I want to go Super Saiyan. Let's look here through our notes. Let's kind of touch on things. Is there anything we missed in here yet? Oh, demi-human clerics. That is something that we had talked about earlier. Personally, for me, I know with the supplements, you could get half-elven clerics and dwarven clerics and things like that. For me,
the only dwarven cleric I know of is from the Gazetteer series.
Okay.
The Rockholm Gazetteer. I don't believe it ever came up as an option in OD&D, and I could be wrong. The only mention I know of in OD&D of anything but a human being a cleric is the half-elf. Now, I think what's interesting about that is OD&D, by its nature, wasn't race as class. There were options for dwarven thieves and halfling thieves, as well as dwarven fighters and halfling fighters. But when Holmes edited it down, he presented it almost as race as class. So it wasn't really until Moldvay, because in Holmes we have mention of dwarves are fighters unless they're thieves, and hobbits are fighters unless they're thieves. So it wasn't until 1981, Moldvay Cook, where we get that distinct separation of this is separate, this race is this character every time. Race is class, class is race. We don't need two terms. We don't need to think of them as two separate things.
Yeah,
it's my preferred play style. I prefer race as class.
I'm
but
in the
with
same
the
boat.
Cleric, I see some of the roots of the cleric being a particularly human thing, as opposed to other classes like wizards and thieves and fighters, which all have racial variance.
Yeah, for me, just for my worldview of a classic D&D world, it's dwarves and humans. I had a conversation about racist class with some friends who I play in a 5th edition game with, and they didn't understand the elf and why elf, I guess they played in a game where there were no elf clerics, a modern game where somebody was like, yeah, elves can't be priests. And they didn't understand that. And for me, it goes back to the literary roots, with Tolkien. there are elven gods, but in Tolkien, elves are immortal. They don't need a deity and they know their gods are real. But if you die, you just come back. You're reincarnated. And so the elven D&D is really interesting. Elves as a race, because they're based on Tolkien elves, but they're also based on the Norse elves, which are just like also otherworldly god beings.
Right. They were hanging out with the gods.
Yeah, they were buddies.
Elves
with gods.
and dwarves, they were just up there. They were part of the whole ecosphere.
Yeah.
That were not Midgard.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I agree. I think it's telling that with even classic D&D, where it wasn't really separated. Race and class were both options, and races could be more than one class.
Yeah.
It wasn't really structured the way that we think of Redbox and Moldvay Cook.
Mm-hmm.
D&D now. Humans were still the only ones really given the option of clerics, and half elves, when they're mentioned as an option for cleric, it's as a fighter, magic user, cleric, and it mentions them kind of leading into their human background to gain that option.
And
so
when we were doing,
why I like clerics being a human option and it not being elven clerics or dwarven clerics is it lets the humans have a personality. Mm-hmm. That the elves may have a different structure and the dwarves may have a different structure for their environment. Their cities may be structured differently.
And if you go with the Seelie and Unseelie court, sort of because elves are a weird grab bag in classic D&D, if you go with like Irish folklore or Celtic folklore, the most powerful elf you made that guy king. Like Oberon, he wasn't the god of the elves, he was just the most powerful one, so you make that dude the guy in charge.
He had the pointiest shoes, so
he did. Yeah. And I kind of use that as an example, like in elven society, like the dude who's the most powerful, the one guy who can like turn anyone into a frog or summon meteors from the sky, like because you're so long lived, like that dude's the same age as you. You and Obi, you were in third grade together. You played on the same t-ball team, and maybe your elvish mother, maybe she berates you for that. She's like, oh, Oberon can, disappear as a whisper on the wind, but how's your flute business going?
It is unfortunate, those elvish mothers.
Yeah,
their standards.
It's Ma, like this is getting a little racist. I don't want to go. This is getting semi-anti-Semitic.
Flutes are my life, Mom.
Yeah, but like, and that's the thing, like, that I really like about there not being elvish clerics, because you're not just a dude with pointy ears. Having elves all be one archetype as an adventurer, the elvish adventurer. You're a fighter magic user blend, and you can't be a cleric. I like that because your whole worldview would be different. And they talked about that on the last class act as elves, where your 30 years to you would be as long as 2 weeks to a human. So you have a completely different alien outlook, and maybe you revere nature's spirits, and that kind of gets into like.
Well, I think that's an important thing to touch upon. The absence of a cleric choice for demi-humans doesn't mean there's an absence of a religious structure for demi-humans.
Yeah. Maybe you revere nature's
It's
spirits.
just the cleric class in and of itself. And one of the reasons why I like to present them primarily as undead hunters is it codifies them in a way that's communicable. Because I think where the cleric gets really into gray areas is when people start going down the path of, well, I want to be a cleric of the god of war. I'm the cleric of Ares. Shouldn't I have a sword? Mm-hmm. And I'm okay with that. But if I codify the cleric as an undead hunter, then I can use that to say, sure, you can be a worshiper of Ares, but as a cleric, your first job is to destroy undead. And what that means is it lets me have a world that has whatever pantheon I want to add to it, whether it be including elven and dwarven gods or not. But it still defines what the cleric does based on something other than just their religious beliefs.
Yeah, I'm like thinking about like elvish clerics, and it's sort of like maybe one way you could justify it in your world, because they have such an alien outlook. They have that resistance to the paralysis of ghouls and things like that, like fighting undead and like things that are aberrant in nature, like a zombie or a ghoul or a wight. That's just part of being an elf. Maybe that's something that the elvish adventurer archetype is setting out into the world to do, but it's not for religious reasons. It's just, he's trying to protect the natural order of the world. And that's the whole thing with, like, do clerics get their powers from a god, or do they get them from a belief? Because now the line's getting a little muddy for me. Like, I'm not sure if... I think for the sake of archetype... I think
that's a table-to-table thing. Subtables have very large, intricate backstories to their world, and some tables have a lot of hand-waving and shrugging, and it goes from there.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm doing that thing that I do often, where I like look for answers but only come up with more questions now. So is there anything else? And that's the thing. I think just for archetype's sake, within the structure of classic D&D, I think that clerics should only be human. I think humans should be the only ones who worship in that capacity, and are the only ones potentially who will take up arms to emulate their god. Because, an elf, like I said, Oberon's just some dude that you went to high school with who one day, learned that he could call lightning from the sky, but he's not any more or less elf-like than you. He just is more powerful. Whereas I think with humans, there's a tangible, I am getting this strength from somewhere else. I'm getting it from either an ideal, or I'm getting it from, embodying those ideals, or I'm getting it from, a god with a little g, or in the instance of Holmes D&D, god with a big G.
Well, Holmes D&D leaves it pretty open for interpretation. Mm-hmm. In Holmes Basic, they've named themselves to one or more of the gods.
Yeah.
It's really only OD&D where you see kind of allusions to Judeo-Christian religion. But I think that's one of the things that I like about racist classes. It does separate it. Elves by nature are magic, mm-hmm. and humans are not. But there are ways for them to also employ those abilities, whether it be through study or be through appealing to a higher power, whatever that higher power may be. So I think that kind of brings us back. We're kind of agreeing here that we like it, being that clerics are kind of a human entity, because It's just one more thing that separates the idea of demi-humans from humans.
Yeah, because it should ultimately be a humanocentric game. I think Gary nailed that when in his original design for the game.
My problem with it is when it becomes a question of elves or clerics, wizards, fighters, thieves, whatever you want to choose. Same with dwarves, same with halflings. It creates a world where every civilization is essentially medieval human civilization.
Yeah.
There's elven cities with elven thieves and an elven wizard over. I mean, it creates this kind of mirror image of the human world in your fantasy campaign being very similar to the dwarven world and very similar to the elven world, where if they are separate, and all elves have these magical abilities, and dwarves by nature are warrior people, it creates a different culture. And your human culture is what you approximate as this fantasy medieval world, and that can be anything at any table. The dwarf culture doesn't mirror that exactly. And the other thing that's good about it is it keeps that from being a mechanical choice. Well, I want to be a wizard, so I'll be an elf because the elf gets these bonuses. Or I want to be a fighter, so I'll be a dwarf because a dwarf gets these bonuses. And it questions, do you want to be a dwarf? Do you want to be an elf? If you don't, then play something else. It's not a mechanical choice. You don't have to fill back into this choice because the mechanics suit your stat rolls and the mechanics suit your idea for how you're going to gain power for your character.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that's the beauty of the simplicity of classic D&D. Your numbers are low. The things that your class does are very much separated from one another. And if you want to fill this role, if you want to play this archetype, you choose, a dwarf. If you're wanting to play a dwarf and not just a fighter who can only go up to 8th level, then you choose a dwarf. If you want to be, a graceful warrior who blends magic and swordcraft, you be an elf. If you want to be a holy knight, you could be a cleric. If you want to be Conan the Barbarian, you could be a thief or a fighter, depending on, which version of D&D your DM's running. If you're running, something that has the thief in it, then you would do one thing or the other. And I really like that. I like the sticking to the archetypes. I don't know. Like, do we have anything else? I think we've covered most of our notes. I do.
Here. One thing I want to say is we have talked a lot about what are clearly our preferences at the table, but I know we both probably feel strongly about this. There is no wrong, bad, fun.
Yeah.
Everything. If whatever system you're running, whatever game you're playing, if you're sitting down the table and having fun with your friends, I'm not judging your game at all.
Absolutely.
The one thing we haven't talked about yet that I do think is worth mentioning, because we are talking about clerics, is wisdom, and how wisdom ties into clerics.
Yeah, so it is their prime requisite. You get an experience point bonus for being wise, and I want you to take the lead on this, because you've brought this up, and I have ideas for where this is going, but I'm really interested in actually seeing like what your idea for this is.
To me, I think it we've seen through the history of D&D a couple of pre-publication character sheets that have more stats on them, so I think things were narrowed down, and I think wisdom got placed on clerics, but there's not a lot in OD&D of an explanation of what wisdom is or does. That explanation of the stats is really in OD&D how they apply to the class. Wisdom is the prime requisite for clerics. That's what the description says. That's explanation of the abilities in OD&D. When they get to wisdom, they say it's the prime requisite for clerics. It may be. I mean, it just says the numbers of what it can do.
Mm-hmm. I'm getting to that section right now as well.
The only thing they really do is kind of compare it to intelligence in a way. The way I remember explaining it so often when I was playing D&D back in the day was wisdom is sort of your common sense, and intelligence measures your book smarts. But I don't know exactly how that applies to clerics, or where I got that idea of that description from, if it was ever described that way in a book or not. But I always remember thinking of it in those terms.
Yeah. And then eventually wisdom became associated with your ability to perceive the world around you, how in touch you were with your surroundings. And I think that's really interesting for the class that has to deal with the unseen things of the world, your holy spirits and gods and natural forces of the world, things that you can't see but can perceive.
That's really where I go with it as well, especially in a lot of modern systems. I'm a big fan of Castles and Crusades. I think Castles and Crusades is a fantastic game. Mm-hmm. But one of the carryovers it has from a modern RPG is the idea of wisdom as perception.
Yeah.
And clerics being a wisdom-based class, it puts them in a weird position of being the most perceptive class. But when you think of clerics, again, as undead fighters first, it really makes sense that they would be very perceptive, because way back in early D&D, one of the rules was listening at the door. You may not hear the skeleton or the zombie because they don't make any noise. Mm-hmm. So requiring that extra perception to battle the undead, and the way you put it was beautiful about perceiving these things that don't really exist naturally in the world. That makes a lot of sense. To allow those in your games where you have perception-based wisdom.
Yeah, definitely the class that is meant to fight ghosts, having a stat that would kind of correlate to ESP, I don't think it was purposeful. I think it's a bit of accidental genius. Because in the original game, you didn't have a perception check kind of score.
There isn't a stat for perception in any version of D&D. In the original game, that was all handled with separate rules for surprise and listening. And I think I have a controversial opinion that the game could benefit from a perception stat. I don't know how many people, if anybody, agrees with that. But
I've definitely looked into house ruling with my group having a 7th stat, which is just perception, and have it being divorced from any kind of skill system.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of skill systems, so that's why I want it there.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to Moldvay now with wisdom, because it's the first place in the classic D&D library that I see wisdom more defined than just by the properties of the class it benefits. And it says the word wisdom refers to inspiration, intuition, common sense, and shrewdness. So I guess that's where I saw that common sense idea. Wisdom aids in solving problems when intelligence is not enough. And then it goes on to how it aids clerics. So
definitely goes in with
I guess I
King Solomon the Wise.
Say again?
Oh, it definitely ties in with King Solomon the Wise.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of someone who's wise, I think of it as somebody who will cut a baby right in half. That's my go-to.
He wasn't going to cut the baby in half. He was just saying that because he's like, yeah, if it's the real mom, of course she doesn't want half a baby.
But I mean, the other person's a psychopath then, by those standards. I mean, anybody at that point would be like, geez, dude, okay.
Yeah, that was the whole test, because that
Back
person
off.
didn't get the baby. It's sort of like, King Solomon's the kind of guy who would definitely, like, if his girlfriend says she's not hungry, he would get a side of fries because he knows that she's going to steal some of his.
That's true. She's going to eat your fries. Be wise, because she's going to eat your fries.
If it rhymes, it's true.
I mean, that's how I measure truth.
Yeah, that's same. All right. I think that should wrap us up. We're coming up here on quite a bit.
Yeah.
I think we've filled our requisite half an hour and then some. Yeah, but I think this is great. I think we definitely discussed a lot of things and said words a whole bunch of times. I'm
just gracious for the opportunity. I've been a fan of the show for years now, and I mean, I'm a nobody off the street, and just to have the chance, hopefully it's been informative and entertaining. I have a great respect for the show in all of its past Voltron forms, and hopefully this Voltron form is successful.
Yeah, and I'm glad to be back. I've been out of the OSR game for a little while, so I'm really excited to kind of go through and explore these routes again. And with that, I think we're gonna say goodnight. We do have one final announcement. Sadly, Carl, we've had a really good run on the show.
It's been great. It's been a good run.
So many minutes that we filled, just over the day, and but sadly, this is going to be our last time doing the show. Save or Die isn't going to end. It's
we can't make a highlight reel, but we could make a highlight reel.
Yeah, I'll edit something together. Kind of a best of this episode. And I just want to thank everyone. Vince, thank you for the opportunity to run the show. And, Carl, it was great getting to know you. I feel like, we had lightning in a bottle, but, we just couldn't keep it forever. It's sad, like after all this time that we put in on this one episode, for us to end it, it seems like it's too soon. It seems like we could have had more premature time. A little bit, yeah. But with that, I just want to thank all the listeners of the Save or Die Nation. Again, I just want to let you know a couple things here. If you want to write in, you can write us in at questions@saveordie.info. Don't forget to check out our Patreon if you're a fan of the show and want to support us. And, like our Facebook page, follow us on osrgaming.org, Dragon's Foot, D20 Radio, reddit.com/saveordie. I have a Usenet forum that I went back in time and started. Just lots of different places where you can reach us.
Find me on Friendster.
Friendster. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. But I think that'll be our show for this week.
Let me tell you something, brother. The Save or Die Podcast Immortal Edition is a production of Wild Games Productions, brother. It is produced for entertainment purposes only, Jack. All other uses are prohibited, dude. So be sure to visit them at saveordie.info for more information, brother. What you gonna do when the Save or Die Podcast runs wild on you? Ooh.